Hi listeners, Jason here. We are excited to finally announce registrations for the biggest psych health and safety community event ever. The inaugural The Psych Health and Safety Conference will be held at the Sofitel Wentworth, Sydney, June 19 to 20, 2024 and offer concurrent virtual attendance. It'll feature live podcast recordings with OG researchers including Christina Maslach and Michael Leiter of Burnout fame, Psych Health and Safety USA podcast host I. David Daniels, Australian super experts including the likes of David Burrows, a special 10-year anniversary integrated approaches to workplace mental health panel with authors Tony LaMontagne, Angela Martin and Kat Page, hand-picked case studies from organisations doing it well, and a very special interview with plaintiff Zagi Kozarov by Catherine Dunlop on that High Court case which we previously covered on the podcast. This event will sell out. Get in quick to secure tickets at early bird prices for the 2-day conference, pre-conference masterclasses, and the VIP dinner. The first 200 in-person registrations also get a copy of her latest book, The Burnout Challenge, signed by Christina Maslach herself. Find out more and register at www.psychhealthandsafetyconference.com. Now, on to this episode.
From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Canada podcast, with workplace mental health becoming a priority for businesses who want to retain staff and prevent burnout. This is the source of information for creating sustainable and psychologically healthy workplaces in Canada.
If you are a new listener to this podcast, we hope you enjoy these episodes as you hear stories and case studies that help you lead, support, and participate in a more psychologically safe and healthy work world. Welcome, everyone. It is an honor to be a guest here for Psych Health and Safety in Canada podcast. My name is Erin O'Byrne, and I've been working in the space of mental health, leadership development, and coaching for over 15 years, both in-house and as a consultant and founder of Work Wellness Coach. I am based in the west coast of Canada, here in Vancouver, BC. I'm acknowledging that the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and I'm grateful to live, work, and play on these lands. I'm also grateful for our guest today. It's a real treat to have Andrew Soren join us from the east coast of Canada in Halifax. We have a bi-coastal conversation happening here, so welcome, Andrew.
Thank you so much, Erin. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, Andrew, you have an impressive background. So I'm going to do my best to give our audience an overview of the great work you're doing as we kick off today's conversation, focusing on your areas of expertise, positive psychology and meaningful work. And we'll chat about how this relates to psych health and safety and our national standard. So Andrew, you are the founder and CEO of Eudaimonia by Design, which is a global network of facilitators, coaches, and advisors who share a passion for well-being and believe organizations must be designed to enable it, and helping them harness the best of scholarship and years of experience to advise organizations to design systems to unlock potential and bring out the best in people. Andrew is also a board member of the International Positive Psychology Association, and he chaired the 8th World Congress on Positive Psychology just last year. And since 2013, he's been part of the instructional team with the University of Pennsylvania's internationally renowned Masters of Applied Positive Psychology program. And that's not all. He is also the past president of the program's Alumni Association, and he's the current host of Meaningful Work Matters podcast. So be sure to check that out. Welcome, Andrew. You have such an amazing career.
Thank you so much, Erin. Thank you.
And tell us, how did you get started in this field? What was that fire that was lit for you?
That's a fun question. So when I think I discovered positive psychology while I was working for a big bank in Canada, and BMO Financial Group, that bank, and I had this job in our corporate university, and that corporate university had a wonderful little library in it at the time. And I remember just walking through the library at some point and kind of going through the racks, and I saw this book called Flow. by a guy named Mike Csikszentmihalyi, and just the title of it captivated me. Flow, the psychology of optimal experience. And I was like, ooh, that just sounds exciting. And I remember pulling it off the shelf and starting to read the dust cover, and immediately just there was this language for all of these things that up until that point, throughout a really varied career and a whole whack of different passions, there was a language to describe these things around experiences of extraordinary creativity, these moments where we just lose ourselves and kind of find ourselves working effortlessly towards extraordinary goals, and all of this wonderful science that existed, that Csikszentmihalyi as a pioneer and many others were working on in terms of trying to understand what's meaningful experience, what's transformational experience. All of those things were were in this book, and I was like, I need to learn more about what this is, and where this guy is, and what's going on here. And the more that I dug and the more that I learned, I very quickly discovered that Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi was one of the founders of this field called positive psychology, and so that was the entrance point of me wanting to learn everything I could about that field.
That's awesome, Andrew, and that flow, right? Getting into it and the flow helping you find your flow in the work you're doing
Exactly.
now.
Exactly. Yeah.
I wonder for those of you, not up on their Greek studies, could you explain that concept of eudaimonia?
Yeah, for sure. Well, eudaimonia is actually very connected to this idea of positive psychology. In many ways, you could say that positive psychology, in some ways, is something that strives to study things like eudaimonia. So, eudaimonia, ancient Greek term. The etymology of eu is good, and daimon is like a spirit, or a god, or a demon that lives within all of us. So eudaimonia, a good spirit that lives within all of us. And if you asked Aristotle, what is the meaning of life? What is a life well lived? Aristotle would have said, a life well lived is a eudaimonic life, a life where every day you're working to pursue some sort of virtuous end. So he would have said virtuous action moderated by reason, something that is truly valued and valuable. Aristotle was writing about all this stuff in the context of ethics. So virtuous, valuable, valued, and value laden, and action, something that you're actually doing in the world. And moderated by reason being, it's hard. This is process work. This is a lifelong journey of trying to make decisions about how do I bring the very best of myself to do often difficult and challenging things. And Aristotle would have said a life of trying to do that every day is going to be a life well lived. That will be an exercise of trying to bring your very best potential, your best good daemon, spirit to the table to be able to accomplish important and virtuous ends. So that's what eudaimonia is. It's an idea that I'm totally obsessed by. It's an idea that philosophers for the last couple millennia have been wrestling with and trying to make sense of. And it's very much core to what the study of positive psychology is all about.
Love that, Andrew. And it's reminding me of the root word of enthusiasm, right? In theos, in the spirit of something. And I think that enthusiasm and flow and people really feeling value. And when we think about psychological health and safety and kind of the root of that, it's really about people aligning to, where their values are and do they feel seen and heard, right? Can you explain, a little bit, Andrew, about some of the work you've been up to lately and all the great things that have come up recently?
Yeah, absolutely. So the most recent work that I've been very focused on is some of the research that's been done on meaningful work. If you just heard everything that I said about eudaimonia, maybe a shorthand for the way that we could think about eudaimonia in the workplace is that, if we are bringing ourselves, the best of ourselves, to truly meaningful work that is significant and worthwhile, is work that has tremendous purpose. That's what maybe eudaimonic work might look like. So I'm very interested in what the science has to say about the topic of meaningful work, and specifically very interested in the relationship between meaningful work and our health and our psychological well-being. And so that's really what I've been focused on recently, digging into this huge exponential growth of research that's really happened over the last couple decades on this field of meaningful work, and trying to peel back the layers on what can sometimes be very surprising impacts on our health and well-being.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I'm sort of wondering about listeners that might be saying, okay, well, we're aspiring for this meaningful work and, that's not always possible. What would you sort of say to that audience, or if people are in the space of, I'm not really in meaningful work?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So first of all, there's all sorts of different kinds of work out there. There's all sorts of different reasons why we do work. And so work can certainly have high levels of meaning or very low levels of meaning. There are all sorts of interesting, wonderful pieces of theory and research out there around some of our orientations or motivations towards work. So some people approach work because work is just very utilitarian. It's a job. I go to work to be able to basically make money, go home, and have the rest of my life. And for many people, that's what work is. But that's not the only thing that work can be. For other people, work can be very much a status driven thing, something that we are ultimately trying to rise through a career. It's a way of being able to think about power or ultimately position or authority within our careers. That's also a perfectly fine way of thinking about what work can be. But work can also be deeply meaningful. Often the word that's used to describe work that's deeply meaningful is work that's a calling. The work is so meaningful in such a way that you would do it even if you weren't getting paid for it. It's really a passion that you're pursuing. And there might be different reasons why that work is a calling for you. Maybe it's because you really care about service and being there for other people. Or maybe it's because you really care about mastery or craftsmanship and you want to get better at this thing that you just care so deeply about. Or maybe it's even about the community of people you work with, what's described as kinship in the literature. Your brotherhood and sisterhood of fellow workers. All of these are different motivations for why somebody might be wanting to work. All of them are fine. There's no value ladenness in necessarily any of those reasons why you might be interested in work. And certainly external circumstance can dictate a huge portion of what work is going to mean for you. But obviously, perhaps not obviously, one of the things that we generally tend to see is that people who find more meaning in their work tend to experience higher levels of well-being and satisfaction in their work as well. There's a high correlation between those two things. Not always, but definitely in a lot of the literature, that's the case.
Yeah, and that really melds well with a lot of the psychological health and safety, the national standard factors here in Canada, right? Around engaging and challenging work, having social supports, and feeling really connected to your work and the community around you. So I wonder if we can explore that a little further. If you take a look at, say, engagement, if that's a factor, and in a workplace, there's lots of ways we can measure that. What would you say to employers that may be looking to say, I'm not really sure where to start with this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, engagement's an interesting term in and of itself. And what does engagement look like in a workplace versus what does engagement look like from a psychological perspective? So I spoke a little bit earlier about the psychology of flow, that work that Mike Csikszentmihalyi pioneered. And so flow is in some ways the way that psychologists ultimately think about engagement, which is full absorption. I'm really involved in the work that I do. I'm so involved that I start sitting at my computer, at my keyboard. I start typing away. I start working on the thing, and then suddenly I look at my watch and it's midnight, and I'm like, "How on earth did that happen?" I just lost a whole entire day of effortless, wonderful, exciting work. Work that is often, as Csikszentmihalyi might have said, at the intersection of challenge and skill, which is kind of what you're saying in terms of what the standard says. We want goals that are difficult, challenging, meaningful, just at our learning edge. That's when we're most likely to find ourselves in flow. So that's one way of thinking about personal engagement at work. Now, of course, work engagement, when we measure it in surveys in organizations, is often something very different. Work engagement is something more like, how much discretionary effort am I prepared to put in at work? How loyal am I to this company? What's the length of time that I expect to stay around here? Those are usually the kind of trifecta of things that are measured when we measure work engagement at work. There's probably a relationship to flow in there. We're more likely to put in more discretionary effort. We're more likely to feel loyal. We're more likely to even be better pro-social citizens in our organizations when we feel things like flow and we feel things like meaning. But engagement in and of itself is kind of measuring, work engagement is often measuring something a little on the side of those things. And I think that what a lot of the research says at this point is that if you want to actually achieve more discretionary performance, loyalty, commitment within the organization, it's actually pursuing the things that bring you well-being, that are the things that are most likely going to actually lead to those kinds of outcomes at the end of the day.
Yeah, and that sweet spot you're talking about, right, is between that level of challenge and skill. And so from a psychosocial factor, right, when it's going well, we know that we can feel it, we're in the flow, we see it in others. What about the flip side? So when it becomes a bit of a hazard or a concern, what does that look like?
Yeah. So this is I think the interesting side of the meaningful work literature that I've gotten really interested in, especially as somebody who has spent my, whole career trying to get people to invest themselves in more and more meaningful work. So, as I just said, the literature on meaningful work says basically, for the vast majority of people, when you engage in meaningful work, your level of commitment goes up, performance tends to increase, loyalty is more present. All of those are really good things. And there's also this literature that's much smaller, that's much quieter, that's much less trumpeted, that basically says when we are engaged in deeply meaningful work, and this is more calling than it is, job in terms of orientation. But when I'm really deeply morally invested in the work that I'm doing, I think that the work that I'm doing is really, really important. What tends to happen is we actually become quite obsessed with our work. There's a researcher whose name is Bob Valorant, who talks about this notion of obsessive passion. We're so passionate about our work that literally it evades everything. And one of the things that starts to kind of ripple over is all of the boundaries in our lives that might be protective factors, that might keep us well in different kinds of ways. So we work really hard, we work more hours, we let the work kind of seep into our whole entire lives. As we do that, we kind of open ourselves up to the potential of alienation. And I say that because we are prepared to work more. We're prepared to work for less. We're prepared to, in some ways, sacrifice the decency of our work because the work itself becomes so important. And when we do that, what winds up happening is that we have more negative affect, negative feelings. We start to feel things like career regret. We start to have lower life satisfaction. The levels of stress in our lives increase. And all of those things wind up spinning out of control and potentially eventually lead us to burnout. And this is a very chronic situation that one can find in many professions where people find themselves engaged in really deeply meaningful work. So we're talking here about nursing or healthcare in general, education, nonprofit sector, NGOs, international aid, basically anyone who's trying to do really good work. Who finds their work deeply meaningful is in some ways at risk of this really negative spiral of meaningful work.
Yeah, and that's, it's important to look because if it doesn't feel like work, the scales start to tip in terms of the passions driving, or there's a disconnect if the meaning isn't there. You're reminding me of all that great research that's out there these days around volunteering and the power of, well, if you're not getting it through work, how are you finding purpose and meaning elsewhere? Yeah.
Yeah,
And what you've touched
completely.
on too is a recent episode we had with Carla Need, who was an occupational therapist, and she really highlighted too, when people are off work for an extended period of time, that sense of meaning and purpose is really important to the work and kind of what will help them get back on track and back into their flow.
Yeah, I think absolutely. It's a huge thing. And again, please, like, for those who are listening, don't hear that what I'm saying is that we don't want meaningful work, because all those other things are still true. We do want meaningful work. We want to feel a deep connection and passion for the things that we do. At least some of us do. Uh, it's just trying to figure out, well, what else do we need? If meaning to a certain extent we often think of meaning as a resource, like that will kind of drive us to be able to achieve more. But sometimes meaning can actually be a demand, and so we have to think about, well, what are the other kind of resources we need to bring to bear when work is deeply meaningful.
Absolutely. What would you say to leaders when they're saying, okay, well, there's how do we find that tipping point between that sweet spot of challenge and skill to so what are some I guess the language I'm looking at is kind of that hierarchy of controls, right? So if we look at a traditional system of health and safety audits, psychological health and safety, and we take a look at what are some of those factors and contributors in the system, and then kind of in that triangle paring down into the individual. When you work with organizations and leaders, how do you help them from that macro and micro levels?
I think first of all is just even understanding that there's a relationship between those macro and micro, or macro system and kind of personal resources. I think that when we talk often about well-being, we think about it as something that's all about the individual. That we're just trying to build resources. Often, when we get stuck in wellness kind of focused conversations, we kind of land ourselves in this kind of fruit, fitness, and flu shots kind of approach to what well-being might mean in the workplace, and we really make it about the individual and about the personal resources that they have to bring to bear. Maybe we give them a headspace, subscription and say, learn how to meditate if you feel stressed. And I think that what we know from the research and the science is that if you are feeling stressed, if you are feeling stretched, if you are feeling burnout, it's probably not your fault. It's probably not because you haven't practiced meditation enough today. Obviously, meditation will be, a protective factor. It might help you, but far better to be able to take a step back and say, okay, what are some of the systemic factors that are leading you to feel the burnout? And there's many different ones that will potentially help kind of help us understand what some of those conditions might be that are leading us to burnout. But there's really two that are probably the most important ones that I think any leader needs to be thinking about, which are largely within their control. So the first one is control. We all want to feel like there is an element of control to our daily lives. We all want to have some sort of element of self-determination within our careers, within our jobs, within the tasks that we do. We want to be able to choose our own adventure, as it were. And that's something that a lot of the time we don't take the time to think about how are we giving people the opportunity to create a sense of control, to create a sense of that kind of self-determination within the context of their jobs. I think second most important thing that we want to be able to do, which is very related, is we want to be able to feel like we matter. We want to believe that our voice is going to ultimately make some sort of a difference. So it's very related to that sense of control, but it's also very much about employee voice. Both of those things within any manager are something that you can work on. There's always going to be a locus of control that you can create within your team. Even if there's very little that you can structurally change about how you do work, there's still always ways in which you can think about the relationships within the team, the way that we even think about our work, the way we are approaching tasks. There's often far more freedom than we give ourselves credit for in terms of how we can craft jobs to create more opportunity for employee voice and more opportunity for a sense of control.
Great tips. Those two around control and that we matter. It's really aligned so well to the factors, right? Around civility and respect. Do I feel valued here? Do I understand how decisions are made, right? Do I have some sense of autonomy and control in the work that I'm doing, how I manage my workload? Absolutely. You're reminding me too of a recent guest that Sir Kerry Cooper, who was he's an organizational psych and health at University of Manchester, and he was talking about the value of work and involving employees in that process. And
Co-creation and finding ways to actually involve people is such a beautiful way of thinking about what control and employee voice actually look like in action. I mean, if you're doing the work as a leader of just spending the time listening and then moving to action and saying, great, how can we co-create together? How can we involve more people in the design of what we want to be able to do? And then go back to listening and say, great, how is this making a difference? Is this working? That creates a real virtuous spiral within an organization. It really feels extraordinarily empowering, not least of which because the things that we're working on are things that we felt were important, and we're seeing the action and progress before our eyes, and we're knowing that we matter. You know what? The idea of mattering, I do love Isaac Prelintensky's work on mattering. He defines mattering as feeling valued and being able to add value. And so that kind of co-creation allows us to add value and then feel valued because we feel heard, we feel seen, we feel respected, all those factors that you're talking about from the standard.
so good about that co-creation. And so part of me is thinking, okay, there's going to be some listeners here, they're going, that all sounds great, Andrew and Erin, but like I don't have time to have all these conversations, I got a business to run. What would you say to that audience?
It's true. This is, it's a challenge. The biggest, it's potentially the greatest challenge of all of this work is that nothing is simple about what we're describing. And it's also, ridiculously simple in so many ways, because it is about having conversations. It is about creating space for dialogue. It is about creating a we situation instead of a me situation at work. But that is hard. It's also different skills than often we're trained for in our organizations. Most people who rise into positions of leadership and power in organizations get there because they're really good at what they do. They're very good at me-focused work, and they're not necessarily always trained on how to have really good conversations, how to listen with genuine curiosity, how to create a space of psychological safety and vulnerability at the work to allow for that employee voice to give people the opportunity for self-determination. And I'd love to say it's a super simple, easy fix, but it's not. In some ways, it's a lifelong practice. It's something that we'll never actually be able to master. Nobody is perfect at it, but it's all an opportunity to constantly roll our sleeves, and to go back to that term eudaimonia at the beginning, to practice the practice of virtuous action moderated by reason, to try to figure out how every day am I trying to help both myself and my team bring the best of themselves to accomplish the things that we think are meaningful and important around here.
Do you need more psych health and safety in your life? Then head over to the FlourishDX Academy for several free on-demand e-learning courses. If you're an internal professional, follow FlourishDX on Eventbrite to register for any of our free fortnightly interactive webinars. Our flagship professional practice program is also exclusively available for internal professionals. The 12-week course blends theory, applied practice, and interaction with other professionals through live lectures and a monthly community of practice session. Find out more about all these learning opportunities or inquire about a bespoke in-house training at the FlourishDX Academy. www.45003.org. Now back to this episode.
Yeah, moving from that me to we, that co-creation. And you remind me too what Carrie Cooper was saying recently about with leadership, there's a 40-40-20 ratio, whereas 40% of people are natural leaders. Like, they get it, they have the conversation, they can see the environment and create the space. And then there's 40% of leaders that, can be trained, and they're keen, and they kind of go, okay, show me the way. What can I do to learn and grow? And then there's 20% that are just not wired for that. They're very good at what they do and their technical skill set. But as far as the people side of things, there's just a wiring there. And so it sounds like it fits with what you're describing too, with different aptitudes, and everybody's kind of on this scale of awareness here.
Completely. And that's fine. I mean, that's fine. I think that, going back to why do we work? I think a lot of people think that they have to rise up into levels of leadership and authority because that's just the way that status and power works in the organizations that we've set up. And I think that we do ourselves a disservice when we say to people, the only way that you can grow at work is through people management. Because you're right. I think that there's lots of people who just, that's not their daimon. that's not their purpose in the world, is to manage other people. And that's totally fine. Those people can offer extraordinary gifts in the world and can build tremendous amount of mastery and craftsmanship in things that they genuinely care about, where they can add tremendous amounts of value. And we should let the people, that kind of 40% who really love the idea of people management, who see themselves as servants to other people's growth and potential, we want them to be leaders.
Absolutely. And, when you think, you're just talking about this co-creation and there's opportunity for conversation, what other, in your research and work, what else do you see that supports this, creating this environment of flow, of positive psychology?
Yeah. So I think that I think about all this stuff in very systemic ways. So obviously that starts at a societal level in terms of kind of what we value and what we prioritize at the societal level. And that's where things like the standard of psychological health and safety, at least in Canada, or the Surgeon General's framework for mental health and well-being in the workplace in the US, in Great Britain, there's all sorts of extraordinary policies around kind of what it is that we ultimately want to create in the world, and how we're going to hold organizations accountable to being able to do that. I think that those kinds of standards are extremely important. And just thinking societally about how are we setting up the conditions where people can truly experience decency, in the words of the United Nations International Labor Association. How do we create decency at work as a fundamental enabler to everything that I'm talking about? Because without it, it's really hard. So I think societally, it's very important. Organizationally, we've been talking about a whole bunch of things that are really within the control of the organization, like culture. What kind of values do you care about as an organization? The more that we can care about people, the more that we can care about mutuality, about giving people a sense of control, hearing people's voice, allowing ourselves to have values that ultimately get at the human beings who are working in this organization, the easier it will be to be able to do any of the rest of the stuff that we're talking about. But having values aren't enough. We need to put them into practice. We need to think about all of the policies, the procedures, the things that we do on a daily basis in our organization, operationally, from a people management perspective, from an HR perspective, things that we often don't really think about, but that we actually have tremendous amount of freedom to control if we want to. How do we make sure that those policies, those practices are actually in service of our health and well-being, and that we're not fighting against them? I think that all of those kinds of things, on top of all of the leadership stuff that we talked about, actually creates a lot of enabling conditions within our organizations. And when those conditions are in place, when we have the right kind of leadership, when we have the right kind of systems and policies, when we have the right kind of fundamental values in our organization, a lot of this stuff is so much easier. A lot of this stuff is actually really just naturally part of the daily rhythms of how we do things. It doesn't take any extra time because it's part of our house.
There's flow, right? It's kind of
There's
just,
flow.
oh,
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. We've designed the optimal experience into the actual work.
Yeah, and what you're describing reminds me of the psychosocial hierarchy of control as well. So, revolutionaries of well-being based in New Zealand created this beautiful framework, and it talked about fixing the work. So, how do you eliminate the hazard, redesign, look at patterns, and then also then kind of filtering into fixing the worker. So, looking at education and well-being and kind of that, PPE for, for well-being, mental health first aid, employee assistance programs, and kind of from the society organizational level and drilling down.
Yeah, I love those kinds of models. And my yes and to that is that I think so often we get focused on fixing the system, fixing the individual, approaching the things that are broken, how we make work not suck. That we forget about what would it look like to be on the other end of the spectrum? What would it look like for our work to actually be a place of extraordinary potential and possibility, for our work to be a place of amazing control and self-determination, a place where everyone feels like they genuinely matter. Just solving all the things that are wrong or broken in our systems and at work are not going to create that context for flourishing and thriving. So we need to do both. It's not one or the other. We need to do both of those things kind of at the same time. And when we do, I think that's when we'll see extraordinary performance. That's when we'll create extraordinarily magnetic workforces where people are going to want to stick around, where people are going to want to come to work. That's where we'll create the kind of loyalty, commitment, and productivity that I think most organizations really want.
That's such a good point, Andrew, right? It's about we usually go to the default of what's not working and what do we need to fix here, and really that flipping it to that appreciative inquiry approach and really like, well, what is working well and what would be even better if, and how that expands our thinking and our way of working, right? We know that that fear model can kind of constrict us, and that sort of what's possible blue sky conversations can really help move the dial.
Absolutely. In realistic ways. I mean, obviously, we don't want to create toxic positivity. We don't want to create cruel optimism, all of these very real things that I think that too much of a focus on kind of unhappiness for happiness' sake can ultimately lead to. But I think that we certainly can create organizations that help us thrive, that help us be eudaimonic. It's certainly my mission.
And what you were talking about, that balance of regulation as well, and how do we I would love to hear a bit more about that side of things, and how do you strike that balance between this is what we need to do and this is the process, and you know yeah, just finding that balance.
Yeah, balance is, I think, everything. I'll go back to Aristotle for a second. So, when Aristotle was talking about eudaimonia, he would have said that the thing that we are ultimately striving for is figuring out what virtuous action actually is. Right? I talked about virtuous action moderated by reason. So the moderated by reason part is that it's really hard to do this well. It's really hard to strike that balance. And the reason it's really hard is because virtue always exists between two vices, right? Any strength can be overdone. Anything, there can always be too much of a good thing. There can be too much meaning, as we were just talking about before. Meaning is a good thing, and there can be too much of it. Even a growth mindset. Folks who say, "I love the idea of Carol Dweck's growth mindset." This idea that we can always be growing, we can always be learning, we can always kind of reframe something to see a challenge or a failure as an opportunity for growth and possibility. Growth mindsets are wonderful. And yet, if we have too much of a growth mindset, if we don't have any sense of a fixed mindset that things are what they are, things can't necessarily change, then we stop striving to fix the system. Activism, to a certain extent, revolution, to a certain extent, requires us to have a little bit of a fixed mindset, a belief that we can't just overcome everything, that we actually have to change a little bit of the system to be able to do that as well. I think that's kind of what Aristotle's getting at when he's talking about about this practical wisdom or moderated by reason notion of kind of what it means to experience and walk the talk on well-being. We need to really think, how do we find that sweet spot? How do we exercise our strengths? How do we make sure that we're striving for all of this good while recognizing the context, the people involved, what this specific situation requires in this specific moment? Again, it's a practice. I don't think it's a destination that you ever reach at. But that practice, exercising that, taking the time to pause and ask ourselves, am I just doing the next thing right, or am I doing the next right thing? Those moments are the moments when we can actually find that self-regulation. We can find that middle ground, that practical wisdom, which really is kind of the mother of all virtues.
Yeah, love it. Going down the Aristotle road in this conversation. It's so important to get back to, right? Those elements. And it's interesting because you're reminding me of in a way, the national standard and ISO, definition of psych health and safety, because it talks about, that balance between promoting well-being and then actively working to prevent the harm and kind of that finding that balance. And even more so with Amy Edmondson and her work in psych health and safety, a psychological safety around, she defines it as it's a means to a goal, and that goal is excellence. If we were to just remember that approach.
Right? Which is very Aristotelian. I mean, Aristotle would have said ethics, excellence, engagement. Those are the things that we're ultimately striving for in our lives. It's funny that we're talking about Aristotle so much today, but I really do believe that the ancient wisdom piece of all of this is really, really important. And we could just as easily be talking about Taoism or First Nation Indigenous wisdoms. In Anishinaabeg traditions, there's this notion of 7 grandfather teachings, which is almost exactly the same as what Aristotle was talking about in terms of virtue in the pursuit of our lives. Right? We need to be able to find balance, to be able to seek truth, but ultimately be able to be held within a set of virtues that we are striving to be able to find, the right sweet spot within. And these things are in almost every single major religion, every single ancient wisdom that you can try to pull down. We could be talking about Ubuntu just as much as we are talking about eudaimonia in this particular moment. And I feel like that is there's something really exciting about this counterbalance between knowing that there's actually a lot of ancient wisdom that we can hold on to. And there's a lot of modern science like Amy Edmonds and all of this positive psychology work that we're talking about that can hold us and help us understand how to be able to achieve some of those ancient principles that have been around with us since probably the dawn of time.
Yeah, it's like, and how do we bring that into our workplaces now, right? What are some things that are happening? And you're actually reminding me, Andrew, of when we met through the Canadian Positive Psychology Association and the Workplace Wellbeing Awards a few years ago. And, what were some of the things that those employers were doing? How were they bringing to life a lot of these principles and practices? How, what would you say to that?
Absolutely. So yeah, the Canadian Positive Psychology Association's Canadian Workplace Wellbeing Awards is this great opportunity to be able to look at what are organizations doing right when it comes to bringing well-being and the standard for psychological health and safety into the workplace. What does it actually look like? What do those practices consist of? And I'll tell you that when we look across and see who has won over the last few years, in various categories, we see go back to those two things, employee voice and a sense of control. The people who've really figured this out are people who understand that one size fits none. They're not just offering an EAP program or a set of benefits to organizations and saying, great, we're checking the box on wellness or well-being around here. They're actually really thinking about how do we co-create? How do we talk to employees? How do we make sure that we're listening to what is important to our employees, to really think about it almost from a human-centered design perspective? What are their opportunities? What are their desires? What are their challenges? And how do we craft well-being related programming? How do we create the enabling conditions and build personal resources within our organizations that really meet our employees where they're at? Ideally, created by and with our employees, as opposed to created to or for our employees. Those are some of the kind of broad things that I've seen, and when that happens, there's so much more buy-in. There's so much more excitement. There's so much more impact that those programs actually have.
Yeah, because it's kind of bringing from that philosophy and psychology into strategy.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And you remind me too of currently I'm working on a contract with GoTo HR and specializing in tourism and hospitality and taking a look at that industry and saying, okay, well, what does this work environment look like? There's a lot of meaning behind the work. How do we strike that balance? And a lot of leaders are questioning, where do I start? Right. And so, how do we continue to have conversations like this? How do we raise that awareness of some of the first steps organizations can take to move the dial?
I think that the start is almost always going to be dialogue. Um, which which again is not going to be for everyone. It's not everyone's going to feel comfortable doing that. Not everyone's going to like it. But if we think again about employee voice and a sense of control, the best way to enact that is by talking to people, by having conversations with your team, and literally just your team, pulling people together and asking them, what does what does well-being actually mean and look like for you? I have a friend whose name is Maureen McKenna, who likes to say that for common sense words like well-being, we have to make sense of them as a commons. So just even taking the time and having a conversation around the table to say, what does well-being mean for you? Recognizing that one size fits none, that everyone's probably going to have a slightly different perspective, but just even understanding what those perspectives are going to change a lot. And if you just start there, if you just start with that conversation and then just say, hey, what's one thing, one small thing we can try this week that might make a little bit of a difference to be able to increase or change the levels of what well-being are in our team this week? What's something that we can try? Just even that. And then coming back the following week and say, hey, how did it go? Did that work? What can we do and learn this a little bit different this week? What can we try now? Just doing that kind of virtuous cycle of listening, acting, tracking progress, listening again, right? Like that cycle is going to be a small thing that you can do. It doesn't even need to take any more than 10 or 15 minutes a week, but it can make all the difference in the world.
Yeah, starting the conversation, right? You're reminding me too of the resources that are out there, say like workplace strategies for mental health. There's some wonderful kind of tools and resources for leaders and employers to sort of say, how do we have the conversation? And yeah, in the 10 minutes that we have at the start of this meeting or in our one-to-ones, right?
Completely. Because you already do it. Like you're already taking that time anyways. So, I mean, find a way to just build in a little bit of extra opportunity. And chances are, especially if you can make that conversation about the actual work so that it's not something separate. It's not like, oh, we all want to go out and have a social or take a day off or do something like that. How can you actually build the well-being into the way that you're doing the work? It's, you're feeding two birds with one seed, as a friend of mine likes to say.
It's like that conversation with employees, and everyone has such a unique lens on what work well-being means to them. I kind of think of that, factor around balance, that life work balance. I like to call it balancing, right? How do we have that balancing of priorities and our what's going on in our life, and it's so unique to everyone. Same with job demand, like reasonable job demand, workload management. For some of us it's, I can handle all of this, and for others it's, varied. What do
Yeah,
you
and
notice?
it's gonna be varied. It's not only varied for the individual, it's also varied. It's varied depending on the day. You know, I it's you know, uh, I think that it's the wonderful complexity of being human, and that's really what it is that we're practicing here. We're basically practicing how do we be more human with each other as we do our work. How do we recognize that we're all variable? We all change. We're all different. Some people work-life balance is a great example. Some people like some the balancing act is actually not going to be a balance at all. Some people are going to want to work until like 2 o'clock in the morning because they just want to. That's what's going to work for them. Some people are not. Some people are going to be able to just invest a huge amount of energy some days, and their battery is going to be really low on other days. That thinking about well-being as a weather report rather than a report card on your team is probably going to be a really important thing in terms of just being able to understand, hey, if we can have a conversation about how we're doing this week, it's going to be way easier to figure out how we work effectively together this week, not forever, but just literally right now.
Yeah, the weather's always changing, right? So stay tuned.
Totally. That's
That's
right.
a wonderful way of viewing it, and it helps normalize, right? In terms of levels of
Absolutely.
productivity and the environment we're
Yeah,
in.
completely.
Yeah, this is great, Andrew. So helpful when you think about, people who are, we spend so much time at work, right? How do we create an environment? How do we ensure that we are bringing our best selves forward? What else would you say around mitigating risks and supporting, cultures where they think, oh, the scale's really tipped, or, we've got to start somewhere?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that what I would say in that regard is just remember there's going to be no silver bullets. there's probably going to be no quick fixes. It's really going to be a culture change that you need. And that's hard. Like, I mean, I just, again, I want to normalize how hard it is because often the system is pretty rigged against us. Capitalism doesn't always make it easy to be able to prioritize human beings and our well-being in kind of a relentless pursuit of kind of progress and profit. Those things are often at odds, and yet it doesn't have to be. I think that there's lots of examples, both at a macro level and at a micro level, that show there's actually lots of positive deviancy. There's lots of opportunities to look towards examples of ways we can do things a little bit different. And to remember that, even if you don't have everybody buying into this, you don't actually need it. You know, it's helpful to have a couple leaders who are true sponsors of what you're doing. You don't need everybody. Find your sponsors. Find the coalition of the willing. There's a wonderful stat that says it takes about 24% of any given population to create change within a system. Find your 24%. Find the people within your system who are totally gung-ho and work with them. Be buoyed up by them. Do this as a we as opposed to a me. And you'll see that change is actually ridiculously possible, wonderfully easy. And it's going to have an impact. And once it starts to have an impact, especially if you start to track the impacts of that impact, if you start to actually measure, how are we doing compared to everybody else, you'll build a business case really quickly. You'll convince more people. You're never going to convince everyone, but you don't need to, right? You just need to try to shift to the folks in the middle to say, hey, look at me, try to do a little bit more of that. And pretty soon you'll change the whole organization.
Simple as that, right?
Simple / kind of like lifelong hard work, but that's what virtuous action moderated by reason. There you go.
Well, and that whole concept of planning, do, act, check in, and just that creating that cycle for
Right.
organizations to have the conversation, check back, how are we doing?
Yeah, easier said than done, but absolutely, this is the practice. Continue to show up, continue to try, and you will see change.
Thanks, Andrew. I think our listeners are really grateful to have heard so much around, some of the factors that create an environment, really understanding the flow. What resources and research would you recommend others if we were interested to learn more?
Yeah, so I highly encourage folks to learn a little bit about this field of positive psychology. The International Positive Psychology Association is a great place to be able to do that. If you're in Canada, the Canadian Positive Psychology Association, there's all sorts of community of people who care about these things, who are interested in both the science and the practice. So check out IPA, check out the CPPA. If you want to read books, there's lots of really good books out there that talk about positive psychology. If there was one that you wanted to read, if you got really excited by the things that we talked about today, you might check out Flourish by Martin Seligman or Flow by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. Those are some great places to start.
It's great, Andrew. You're reminding me of one of my favorite books from Zen and the Art of Motorcycle
Motorcycle
Maintenance.
repair. That's right. Exactly.
Robert Pirsig, and that quote from his book was, "The place to improve the world is first in one's own heart and head and hands, and then work outward from there." Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Any final words of advice, wisdom to share with our audience today?
Keep trying. Know that it's a practice. Know that it's a journey, and that a life of doing that every day is going to be a life well lived.
Yeah, and taking away things like that from me versus we, and really that co-creation and collaboration. I loved the history that you brought forward from philosophy right down to the practical strategies and some tips people can take away. You mentioned the weather report. Like, how do we just take a pulse check in our organization, you know without the judgment or hesitation that some of us can feel, it heaviness around, it's not working, let's check the weather, normalize it. And this positive deviancy, what a phrase.
It's a beautiful one. One of my favorites.
That's great. Thank you so much for all that you shared. Now, if our listeners want to get in touch with you, how can they connect?
Absolutely. Please visit my website, which is www.eubd.ca, eubd.ca. There you'll find all sorts of information about how to get in touch with me. You can also check out the podcast, which is on that website, All Meaningful Work Matters, or connect with me on LinkedIn.
That's so great. Thank you, Andrew. If we would love to also hear from you, our listeners, you can reach out to myself via LinkedIn or my website, workwellnesscoach.com, or to our host, Kim McDonald, on LinkedIn or 13factors.ca. We're always looking for topics and guest ideas, so please reach out and chat with us. Check out our other episodes, guests, and topics. If you would like what you are hearing today, please spread the word on social media. We need more conversations like this to be heard. Our goal is to inspire learning and focus on psychological health and safety, and the impact on mental health at work, so that every person, regardless of their job, industry, or occupation, can, go home from work not only safe, but better, in a better state than they arrived. We spend so much time at work. Let's make it a great place to be. And a special thanks to Flourish DX, our podcast sponsor, for making this podcast possible. Until next time.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Canada podcast. To stay up to date with the best content on workplace mental health in North America, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and join the Flourish DX community at www.flourishdx.com.